very much to Hans-Georg, Gerald, Trent, and Hilary for such an interesting and, as expected, provocative discussion of pre- and post-market evidence generation. And as the four panelists for the next session come up, we're going to continue this theme with this very esteemed panel. So I have three of the four, and Anne-Virginie is on her way. There's a dearth of microphones. So we're very fortunate to be joined by our next panel, who really do represent multiple stakeholders in the healthcare innovation field. And that is what you'll see throughout the day today, is that we really are trying to bring all the stakeholders into this important discussion. I'm going to wait for Anne-Virginie. So on my left, Nick Crabb is the Program Director for Scientific Affairs at the National Institute for Healthcare and Care Excellence, which has one of the most amazing acronyms known, which is nice. Anne-Virginie Eggimann on the right is the Vice President of Regulatory Science at Bluebird Bio, one of those no longer startups that Hilary mentioned that you can throw a stone from here and hit. Robyn Lynn, at my left, is the Senior Science Advisor with the Office of Legislative and Regulatory Modernization, Health Products and Food Branch at Health Canada. And Newell McElwee is the Vice President of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at Boehringer-Ingelheim. So our goal this morning is to discuss the various types of evidence that are required by the different stakeholders, and in particular, the experience of these panelists in generating, providing, or assessing that evidence. While we are focused on real-world evidence, as Radek talked to us this morning, we will also hear about the full range of evidence generation across the product lifespan. So we want to start with a very concrete example. Bluebird Bio was one of the first companies to participate in the European Medicine Agency's Adaptive Pathways pilot program. As Vice President of Regulatory Science at Bluebird Bio, Anne-Virginie has been very involved with the strategy around the required real-world evidence development for the pilot. And so we'd like to ask her about some of her experiences.
Thank you, Kay. Is this working? Okay, great. So yes, Bluebird Bio is focusing on the development of gene therapy products for a number of rare diseases, and we were fortunate to be part of the pilot starting in 2014 for the development of our product called lentiglobin for the treatment of beta thalassemia, which is a rare blood disease. And over the past 3 years, we've had a number of interactions within the agency, which started with a safe harbor discussion with multi-stakeholders present, including HTA bodies and patients' representatives. And from my perspective, that was really the most useful from the pilot, was having these safe harbor discussions. And I know that the agency is closed the pilot for now, and that these safe harbor discussions are harder to have. But I would certainly encourage everyone to think about having some of these forums, because I thought from our perspectives that was the most helpful. And during these discussions, one of the first things that came up was to encourage Bluebird Bio to think about collecting real-world evidence. And the agency challenged us to really think through that. So it's been 3 years, and I'm happy to say that we've made some progress. However, and I'll go through some of the challenges that we had to go through, but we're just starting to get data now. I haven't seen it, but our real-world evidence group is just starting to get it. So that gives you an idea of how long it takes to start interacting with the data sources, both in academia and with CROs. So trying to identify registries that exist that are either also sometimes managed by patients' organizations, and try to decipher, do they have the data elements that you're looking for? Once you figure out that they do, then you need to have access to that. And so there are privacy issues that come up. Will the data sources analyze the data, or will you do these analysis? And all along the way, you're still not sure what you're going to get. So I would say that this is a long journey. And from my perspective, in terms of what would be really helpful to catalyze and accelerate the generation of these evidence eventually, would be to have patients' organizations really driving some of this. Our experience in beta thalassemia is that it's very fragmented, all the data sources, and there is a lack of harmonization in terms of the data elements, which we're hopeful over time will get there. But I think patients' organization could really be a strong force along with the agencies to bring all the stakeholders together to look at these data elements, and hopefully perhaps different companies as well, to be able to harmonize that so that at least you have a stronger data set. And we are also interacting with databases that are focusing on transplants. So because our gene therapy involves full myeloablation, and it's similar to a transplant procedure. So there's different types of databases that we can look at. And for example, the transplant databases do not measure the outcome from the disease perspective as much. So we're working with them to try to improve the amount of data that they collect. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Anne-Virginie. It's amazing. It's a really concrete example of something that is ongoing and with the benefits and the challenges, and we'll get back to that in a little while. Nick, you and I discussed, and we discussed as a group, a very specific example that exists in the UK, where evidence generation is an essential component, and that is the Cancer Drug Fund. And I wonder if you could explain to people what the Cancer Drug Fund is and how evidence plays into that particular endeavor.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kay, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. And it's really great to be able to participate in such a sort of forward-thinking conference. Before I get on to the Cancer Drugs Fund, I just sort of quickly like to say that as well as the CDF, we've got arrangements through sort of scientific advice and dialogue through what we call our Office of Market Access. And these provide really important opportunities for life science companies to engage with NICE in their sort of planning, their sort of evidence development, and their market access strategies more generally. Part of that is that we can also provide that sort of scientific advice in collaboration with other HTA agencies in Europe, as well as with the EMA. Now, the way they're set up in the UK, we don't have any taxpayer money for those activities, so we have to offer those on a fee-for-service, but not-for-profit sort of basis. And I guess they're the sort of key opportunities, far upstream to really build in the sort of HTA payer perspectives from a very early stage of product development. And I think that's the critical starting point for these more sort of adaptive approaches. But moving on to the Cancer Drugs Fund, the fund was initially introduced really as a political promise during an election campaign. That's how the fund arose. And I think it was quite useful in providing patient access to a number of cancer medicines over the years. But the fund kept sort of overspending. It had to, the budgets had to be continually increased. And I guess one of the issues was that it was outside and parallel to the sort of NICE process. And it was sort of extensively reformed in 2016 and much more integrated with the NICE processes. And I think it's actually become a really important mechanism to support sort of adaptive biomedical sort of innovation. So just to try to briefly describe it, the appraisal of cancer medicines by NICE now happens very far upstream, with the idea being that draft guidance can be issued very shortly after the CHMP opinion and in advance of more marketing authorization. And one of the provisions of the CDF, the Cancer Drugs Fund, is funding for new medicines with positive draft guidance by NICE from the point of MA. So I think we do have a mechanism for products that are considered clinically and cost effective by NICE for funding from the day of the marketing authorization. Now, the options that are open to our advisory committees when evaluating these products are recommended for routine commissioning, not recommended for routine commissioning, and they traditionally were the main decision options available to NICE committees. But we now have a very important third one, which is recommended within the Cancer Drugs Fund. Now, to be recommended within the Cancer Drugs Fund, firstly, there must be insufficient evidence for a routine decision. This isn't a soft option. In the absence of the Cancer Drugs Fund, the answer would have been a clear not recommended. So there must be insufficient evidence, but it must also be plausible from the available evidence that NICE's criteria, including NICE's cost-effectiveness criteria, could be met. And then when something's selected for the Cancer Drugs Fund, managed access arrangements are put in place, and they comprise sort of commercial access and data collection arrangements. Now, the sort of commercial terms are pretty much always confidential. But one important feature is that the agreed price while something is in the CDF is very likely to be lower than the price that was included in the original submission to NICE. And I guess this sort of lower price is reflecting the uncertainty, and by having a lower price, it reduces the risk of NICE recommended products that in reality prove not to be cost effective. I know we don't like talking about pricing in new digs, but I think it is important to remember that in terms of decision risk, which is sort of the sort of thing that NICE is really trying to manage, then there is a very, very fine interplay between sort of pricing and commercial agreements, and the level of evidence uncertainty. And I think we need to remember that if we're going to find solutions to these really, really complex problems. Now, following the data collection period, which we expect to typically be just around 2 years, the product's reappraised by NICE, taking account of the new evidence available. And at this stage in the process, we're back to our 2 original decision options. So it's either recommended for routine commissioning or it's not recommended for routine commissioning. And in the reappraisal submission to NICE, the company may adjust the price based on the learning from the data collection period. And I think that's really, really important. If we're going to have adaptive approaches, then they have to be adaptive in both directions. And where things, prove to be, to exceed expectations, it's really important that sort of pricing can go up as well as go down. I think that's a really important part of the sort of trust needed for adaptive pathways. Now, obviously, it's quite early days because these arrangements were put in place in 2016. So far, we have 11 products that have been recommended for use in the Cancer Drugs Fund. Unfortunately, we're a little bit too early to be able to give you an example of something that's been all the way through and come out the other side. But we do have the first reappraisal of a product ongoing. So pembrolizumab for untreated PD-L1 positive metastatic non-small cell lung cancer was recommended for use within the Cancer Drugs Fund in June this year. So it's only June 2017. And a managed access agreement was put in place. Now, the primary source of data collection in the data collection agreement was actually an ongoing clinical trial. So that really helps. So because I think real-world evidence sources are still quite immature. So the fact that there was an ongoing trial was very helpful. And that trial was anticipated to conclude pretty soon. In addition to that, we have collected further information from the systemic anti-cancer therapy database in England, and we very much hope that we'll be using this sort of SAC database quite a lot to support products in the Cancer Drugs Fund. And that's actually a mandated data set as part of the Health and Social Care Information Standards in England. The commercial terms in this case were confidential. The reappraisal review of that product and that indication has started, and we'll hopefully have final guidance sort of mid next year. Okay, I'll stop there, but obviously happy to sort of answer any questions or talk to people afterwards.
Thank you, Nick. And we were very interested in that discussion because obviously the idea of the adaptive, about thinking about things, using evidence, reducing uncertainty is so important in all the different ways that it can be used. So Robyn, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about this concept of uncertainty and how evidence and the needs of evidence to reduce uncertainty is so important of the work that is done by the regulators but continues to be done after the authorization.
Yeah, thanks, Kay. Yeah, I have a particular bugbear with evidence uncertainty, which goes back a few years now, having been a regulator and reviewed the files for 10 years. And I'd like to parse out the uncertainty part even a little further. There's avoidable uncertainty and there's unavoidable uncertainty. And I think where it's particularly frustrating at those decision points, whichever they are for whichever party, is when you're dealing with what could be, frankly, have been avoided uncertainty. So, we've heard a lot about real-world evidence and cost and fragmentation, and we need to do things better, and how do we get the patient, focus in there. A couple things come to mind. First of all, we've talked about real-world evidence and data as the data, or more patient-focused approaches. One way to think of it is also, and big bad RCTs, maybe it's if the opposite of real-world evidence is contrived world evidence. And it'd be great to be able to move right across the life cycle to less contrived evidence all along, where we consciously think more together about how to do right things right more of the time, consistently. Yesterday we heard some fantastic talks about I Spy and a few others where you've got planetary-sized brains working on this stuff. You're seeing the top of the top of the top. But when you're a regulator, you're not seeing consistently stellar evidence all the time, and it's really frustrating when you have to deal with the avoidable uncertainty, which arguably could be managed all the way through better and not have to just sort of come up with, oh, well, I guess we don't know now. We'll have to try to do something to fix what we arguably could have, at least in some instances, have done better at the beginning, as well as then do it more seamlessly, to really understand what's avoidable and what's unavoidable at which points, because that will shift over time as well.
Yeah, Robyn, thank you. Dear to my heart as well as a statistician, we always believe that people think that analysis can resolve anything, but truthfully it's the time you put into design, whether it be design of a trial, design of evidence generation, that's going to pay off in the end. So Newell, we've talked a lot about different types of evidence, but obviously as looking from where you are in the health economics and outcomes space, and how have the evidence requirements changed with regards to these downstream stakeholders? Are you seeing different requirements, and how are the sponsors managing that?
Yeah. So, well, first, I just want to thank you and Gigi for inviting me, and especially Eric Small for handling all of the logistics, which I'm totally incapable of doing myself. So I want to address that question in a slightly different way, and picking up on what Hillary said in the previous panel, and that is that I've been in many situations in the UK and Canada and in the US where payers and regulators are in the same room, and there really is not much agreement. And there seems to be this belief that if we continue putting people in the same room that we're going to get an agreement. I'm not sure that that's going to happen, and I'm not sure that we're going to be able to put all of these different types of things into a single platform trial. And, Gigi started off yesterday talking about silos, and Mark started off today talking about decisions. And the way I think about the differences in the evidence requirements is that all of these groups are making different decisions. And they all have different evidence preferences. And so if you look at what the regulators are asking and what they're trying to accomplish, they want very high internal validity. They want to isolate the effect of the drug. They want to do the study under GCPs, very tightly controlled. That is very different than what the payers are trying to do. They want very high external validity. They want it generalizable to their patients. It's just a very different question that they're asking. And so I'm not sure that we're going to be able to do both of these in the same platform trial. So we have, of course, evidence plans that we develop for payers. I think that, you mentioned, I think, the scientific advice process for NICE, and many of the HTA agencies have that process now in place, which is very helpful for us. We do not have that process in the US. which is a little bit frustrating because I've gone out and asked payers in the US if we could get their input. And of course, because of a lot of the anti-kickback laws, we can't pay them. We can't reimburse any expenses for them. And so then they come back to me and say, okay, so you want me to get a bunch of highly paid people in a room for a day, and what do we get in return for that? So it's really hard to get that input. We need a better process for that in the US. So there is a third decision that we haven't really talked about much, but Janet Woodcock mentioned yesterday, and it is the individual treatment decision that one patient and one doctor make in an exam room with the door shut. So now it's no longer about averages. That was what Janet mentioned yesterday, because if I'm a patient, I want to know if it's the best option for me. I think we've done a horrible job of generating evidence to inform that decision. So I think that's a huge opportunity for us to think about how to do that in a better way. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you. And no, you actually segued beautifully into the next part of the discussion, because what I really want to now ask is, what is the next big thing? Where do we think in evidence generation, as we're thinking about the types of evidence, the requirements of evidence, because as we're thinking of the LEAPS project and how we're going to match up the R&D with the care delivery system, what do you think from your viewpoint is going to be the next big thing? And Robyn, I'll start with you. Sorry.
I'll get my crystal ball out.
What would you like it to be, as Hans-Georg said?
I'd like it to be where we don't hear as much of this issue about this Venn diagram of evidence needs being so not overlapping. That, you know, regulators want internal validity and we just want everything tight, and the rest of everybody wants all the other stuff. I know it's a big ship to turn around, you know, but I've been in review, you know, since 1996, and I've been at the other end of trying to figure out how to do it better. And I can tell you that regulators are not at that place where we were even 10 years ago about all we want is internal validity. I mean, we need to be able to interpret the evidence, and it's great for us all to be able to interpret the evidence. And to do that, we need to reduce noise wherever possible and reduce bias wherever possible, whatever the source of evidence or data. But, you know, it is our job, we are mandated by law to continue to try to understand how best, if something's on the market, how it should be used, the conditions under which it should be used, which populations or subpopulations it can be optimized for use in, who it works best in, who it doesn't work best in, who have the tolerability issues, the toxicity. Those are real issues to us in regulation now. Maybe they weren't 20 years ago when we were all contrived, but it is still it is becoming more and more a real thing now. So I'd like to think, absent the cost issue, which is hardly trivial, that the evidence base that we all need is actually not that different. What we need is meaningful evidence, interpretable evidence, where we're not dealing with frustrating uncertainties that maybe some of which could have been dealt with earlier. We could bake in some of these meaningfulnesses and interpretabilities more of the time, more consistently, so that we're not all sort of herding cats. We need to think more together. And I take your point that it can be really hard when you put them all in a room. You still get everybody tossing things at each other, but you need to think hard together about the trade-offs. I think Gigi mentioned, or was it Mark, or maybe both, the idea that we all still need to win, but maybe we don't win quite as much, but we need to figure out where the points of difference are and come out with the trade-offs we all need to make to get to the bottom line, which is better stuff for patients, which is more meaningful treatments for patients on safety and efficacy and you know, effectiveness and cost. And the more we can try to reduce the failures, and the failure rate is high, folks. I mean, 50% attrition at phase 3, you know, and not just because we know the drug doesn't work. A good proportion of that failure is because we don't know from the evidence whether it's a good or a bad drug. And that's a problem. And if we could reduce the cost, we've heard about the cost of how much these things are to develop. If you could reduce the attrition rates, maybe that would help drive some other nudges in pricing, maybe.
Maybe. Thanks. And Virginie, what's your big wish? We're getting to the end of the year. It's time for those big wishes.
So I ended at that a little bit earlier. I think for me, it's patient registries and thinking about health electronic records. So on the patient registries, I think, my wish list would be to have all the stakeholders get together and agree on, and I know that this has been done, for example, I think good examples are in cystic fibrosis and multiple sclerosis. So I'd love to see that in more diseases where all stakeholders get together and agree on what data elements would be ideally captured, and have patients' organization really drives this process with all the industry stakeholders involved. I think that would go a long way, and improving access to electronic health records. I know there's a lot of technology issues involved in that, but I think having also that input in the decision making will be very important. I'm optimistic in nature, and I do think that the Venn diagram is actually moving in the right direction, and that for me it's okay if payers and HTA bodies want things that are different from the regulators. What I want to know is, what do they want? And I want to know early. And then it's up to me to decide whether it goes into my trial or it goes into the real-world evidence efforts, or I'm going to commission a specific studies to evaluate the cost of certain things, or develop a PRO. That is up to the sponsor to do the best job in collaboration with patients' organizations. So that's okay. I think the challenge that I've seen is that it's actually hard, and obviously I come from the regulatory perspective, but it's been hard in the interactions where I've been to actually get clarity on what the payers and the HTAs want. Sometimes because the sponsors are not willing to really ask the hard questions, but I would love to have additional clarity and have, and in the US as well, it would be fantastic to be able to have really, really clear discussions where you ask clear questions and you get clear answers. But that takes a lot of trust.
Takes a lot of trust, and it takes a lot of effort on part of the sponsor. So as a small biotech, can you imagine if several years ago, when you were really early in that program, you'd gone to Nick and said, we need to go and talk to the payers, and he's looking at you crazy saying, but we need to do this phase 2 clinical trial, and the resources are not there as much, or the thought may not be there yet to do that.
Right.
Yeah. So, Nick, what would be your one hope of the evidence, in an evidence point of view, of what you think would be great to see moving forward?
Sure. Well, I mean, I very much agree with the two previous answers. So I think I'll sort of take a slightly shorter term sort of perspective, and I think there's been a huge amount of investment in real-world evidence and trying to work out how real-world evidence can be used to really help with some of these issues. And I think some really great work's been done. There's a really good IMI project in Europe, Get Real, that some of my colleagues at NICE were heavily involved in. And I think we learned a great deal from those sort of studies. But I still feel a little bit anxious that we're not quite there yet, and that we don't completely understand what's translatable into routine practice in the short term, and the extent to which sort of healthcare records can help or hinder this. And I mean, I already talked about our SACT database in the context of the Cancer Drugs Fund, but I admit to some residual nervousness as to whether or not the sort of information we really need to get is going to be available from that. So I think I would like to see really determined efforts to just, the final push to get some elements of real-world evidence embedded in what we do soon.
Thank you. And finally, you've started this, so now we're going to ask you to continue it. What are your hopes?
Well, I've learned in the past 24 hours that I'm actually a Bayesian, because my priors today are very different from what they were this time yesterday. So I actually think that it is possible to do these platform trials. I wouldn't have said that yesterday, but I believe it is possible. We have to move in that direction. I've been a long-time supporter of adaptive trial design, and when I was at Merck, you heard Eric Rubin's presentation yesterday. I was involved in some of that, and I think that applying the adaptive trial design to things like E2E would be very interesting to do, because mostly what is done, at least in the US right now with adaptive trial design is on selecting the right dose. And occasionally there's some, some basket trials, but we need to be adapting on effectiveness and not dose. Well, we may need to be adapting on dose too, but in addition to dose, we need to be adapting on effectiveness. So that's where I hope that we go.
So thank you. Thank you to everybody for the hopefulness that we're going to end this on. So I'd like to open it up to the audience for some questions, except Mark has a question or a comment.
A suggestion, if it's okay with you.
Of
To
course.
put us back on time, would you like to take questions over coffee instead of formally here?
Absolutely, be happy
Would that
to.
be all right to do that?
Sure.
And that we will stay back on time?
That'd be great.
That'd be great. She agrees. So badger them over coffee, if you would. And we will rejoin here at 10 o'clock in about 15 minutes. Thank you so much.